The Blue Jewel.
Chapter 9. Part 2. They arrived at the port. The scale of the construction was gigantic. The harbor alone was almost as large as the city of Thame itself. Huge but simple in design, it consisted of 2 marble pontoons of more than a kilometer. They docked at the outermost end of the port. Captain Labres did not want to risk the integrity of his ship or his crew for nothing. They disembarked in silence, all carrying their weapons. Aris consulted a map with Kush. Although they had plenty of time, they should not waste it, so they chose the shortest way to reach the temple. The half-orc turned to give the precise orders. First, we should not separate, or make noise. They say that this place is safe during the day, but I do not want to tempt fate. Remain silent as much as possible. The essential thing is to protect Arian. If any of the group gets lost, his fate will depend on himself. Formation: Gosberg and I in the vanguard. Kush, Arian, Vanus. Behind, Kritus, Ulak, Mulak, Gulak and Sabu. 5 meters away, Agnorak covering the rear. Any questions? No one said anything. Gosberg lit a cigarette and began to walk. At the end of the pier they headed towards a marble arch that indicated the end of the harbor and the beginning of the city. They advanced at a steady but cautious pace. Aris occasionally consulted the map, but the guide was from the Denka, who seemed to orient himself quite well in the abandoned city. Arian was hypnotized. The ruins had her enthralled. There were no animals, the vegetation was sparse, only some weeds grew in the corners. The structures of the buildings were quite well preserved. They vaguely reminded the young woman of Caesarea. She could tell which building was an inn, a store, a temple, or a house. Everything was familiar to him. It seemed that the city had been abruptly abandoned just a few weeks ago, when in fact it had been abandoned for thousands of years. That detail caused him more terror. Something strange inhabited this city, a quiet place in the light of day, not at all the nest of evil as the books described. After 2 hours of walking they relaxed a little and arrived at a large square where a large granite statue was located. Arian approached to observe her better. The statue was a beautiful, muscular young man, with long straight hair. Between his hands raised to the sky, he had a sphere in his hands that seemed to be an object with enormous power. It's wonderful. Arian disobeyed Aris' prohibition to speak, but he did not say anything, who like the rest contemplated the statue in amazement, had never seen anything like it. Elaban, the god of mortals, the protector of the helpless, is the moment in which he delivers the jewel, the triumph of Elaban, to the kingdom of Erebanine. They had heard of the cursed god, but had never seen a representation of him. In the Wizard Council's library they had been removed from all the books in the library. Kush stayed by the young woman's side. In my land Elaban was not forgotten. He was a god of hope, for his youth, his beauty, his character and his determination. Aris dryly spoke again. It was cursed like this whole city. We must continue. On the way back we will pause here to rest. Aris stopped because in front of them in that square they had 3 large avenues. Which of them would take them to the temple? The half-orc consulted the map and then spoke with Kush and Gosberg. The latter was the one who seemed to have it clearer. According to the Denka the central avenue was the right one, but the magician and the half-orc did not seem very convinced about it. I know that on the map it indicates the avenue on the right, but that is because the map was not updated. The city was remodeled a little before his misfortune so that the avenue that led to the temple was larger and the number of pilgrims was greater. At the Dinga's speech they resumed the march and advanced at a good pace. A vision bewitched Arian. All the buildings were shadows that appeared before her, indicating the glorious past of the city. They reached a part of the avenue where the buildings were not simple small houses. To their left there was a large grove, to his right appeared a huge building with many floors and windows. To your left is the Park of Dreams, a place that had been created to recreate your mind and achieve inner peace, and to the right is the House of Healing, where the sick were treated. Arian looked at the Denka, who was the one who spoke of the buildings they were now observing. How do you know so much about the city? She asked. My family was originally from here. so I know a lot about the history of the cursed city. They crossed a simple bridge with a single arch that crossed a river that crossed the city. The river was called Albrisha and its waters were crystal clear and transparent, but there was not a single fish inside. There in the background appeared before them the abandoned temple. The square was completely clear in its center. The temple. They reached the north entrance. They remained in silence contemplating it, more than 50 meters high and more than 20 wide. The doors were locked and they reached his height. Aras spoke. Here we are, an hour ahead of schedule. We must enter. Gosberg, please. The Denkga silently advanced to the door and placed one of his large ears on the door. These doors don't have locks. This temple didn't need them either, so. He took his ear out of where it was resting and with both hands pushed the two doors in. They moved slowly and the noise of the hinges that creaked from the time in disuse was heard. Gosberg smiled when he saw that he was right and that the interior of the temple was showing before them. You see, we can enter the temple. Go after me. I don't think it contains traps inside, but you never know. The Denkga advanced inside the temple and the rest slowly entered behind him. Arian thought that some artificial lighting would be necessary inside the building, especially because of the gloom that reigned at the entrance. He used the light stone that the king of Demember had given him and Vanus his. They found other doors just as large as the previous ones. These were locked. Kritos snorted when he saw that it could not be opened while Gosberg was using his skill with the locks. Didn't you say that they didn't need to close the temple? Asked the dwarf, quite annoyed. Gosberg smiled. Well, some precautions don't hurt. The group entered the great hall of the temple and there was no longer any need for light, since it entered from large skylights located in the ceiling. There were no columns, nor any kind of superficial ornament, only a huge rectangular room. In the central part was the circular-shaped pond, in the center of which was a small island with an altar, where the jewel was located, much larger than his brother's. It shone dimly under the sunlight. Elaban's triumph. They observed the jewel in silence. It was a simple sphere of more than 30 centimeters in diameter. It did not seem much, to be honest. But that strange blue glow made it an object that attracted quite a lot of attention. They advanced until they reached the pond that was quite deep, a little more than 1.5 meters, but the water level was low. It did not reach their heels. Although it was stagnant water, there was no smell of rot. This was where the sick who bathed and were cured thanks to the power of the jewel, said the Denkga as he jumped into the pond. Well, Arian, Sabu, go for the jewel next to Gosberg. Kush, Agnorak, guard the flank on the left. Arian obeyed and went inside the pond helped by Sabu. Gosberg had already reached the central island. Agnorak and Kush stood on the other side of the room to protect, but the eyes of the wizard and half-orc landed on the mural in front of them. As Arian reached the little island, Sabu lifted it with his huge arms until he reached the height of the jewel. In ancient times, a waterfall fell over the jewel and the waters were impregnated with its power. Afterwards the priests made incantations and prayers to heal the sick when they bathed in these waters. Only you can take them, if you are really a priest, of course. Arian looked suspiciously at the Denkga. What if I'm not? Gosberg smiled. In short, one has to die of something. Arian looked suspiciously at the Denkga, but climbed on a ledge that he had on the altar and raised his right arm, stretching it completely. He had the jewel within his reach. He hesitated for a moment, but his fingers touched it lightly. She felt a small shock when she touched it and then grabbed it tightly and took it off the pedestal. And then, as happened before with her brother's jewel when it was in her hands, the triumph shone again and its light completely flooded the room. They could then see the temple clearly, but the walls were full of engravings and glyphs. At the south entrance there were 2 stairs that descended into the earth located on both sides of the room. Silis Namarek. What are you saying? Kritos nervously asked the Kendali, who was staring with her yellow eyes at the stairs, and answered the dwarf with a sinister murmur. That's where the damned sleep. The dwarf looked back at the stairs in terror and gripped his crossbow tightly.